Отож, шановні друзі, дорогі колеги, я рада вітати сьогоднішнього першого доповідача. Перший доповідач у нас Віталій Черноїваненко. Пан Віталій – фахівець із юдаїки, він кандидат історичних наук і співзасновник магістерської програми Університету Києво-Могилянська академія. Пане Віталію, прошу.
Дякую, пані Світлано. Я одразу хочу вимкнути презентацію. І, як завжди, намагаюся згадати, як це зробити в Zoom. Так, зараз...
Так, ми бачимо ваш екран.
Так, ви бачите мій екран, але треба не екран. Ага. То я тисну просто з екрану, так, презентацію?
Так, просто відкривайте свою презентацію.
Угу. Вона з'явилася?
З'явилася, так.
Є? Чудово.
Можете просто розгорнути її на весь екран.
Але і так видно, так? Якщо отак от, то видно.
Боку слайди, але якщо так. Тільки
так видно, так?
Слайди. Так видно, так. Але якщо ви хочете, щоб більший екран був...
Ні, мені так зручніше, якщо можна.
Так, звісно.
Okay, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you much, dear Svetlana, for introducing me. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Thanks. So let's move to my presentation. And I would like to start with a short introduction. The academic research of queer narratives within its historical context has been developed in the second half of the 20th century, primarily in Europe and in the USA. First, such research emerged amid a full-scale discussion concerning the place of sexual minorities in this society and their rights. Secondly, the studies on queer, this term itself has become commonly accepted, including in the academia lately enough and refers mostly to the 1990s, arose from a vivid general interest in the theory and history of sexuality, which appeared starting from the late 19th century. In this regard, we should mention the names of such significant scholars who represent various branches of scientia sexualis like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Sigmund Freud, Magnus Hirschfeld, Alfred Kinsey, Fritz Klein, Michel Foucault, David Halperin, and others. Thirdly, as I presume, the queer theory was produced by the identity theory, along with national, cultural, gender identities. During the last third of the 20th century, theologians, mainly the representatives of so-called Abrahamic religions, have also started to look into queer while discussing the question whether homosexuality or another non-normative or non-heteronormative model of sexual behavior is a sin and a crime against God. From the same time, homoerotic narratives of history and culture became subjects of interest for historians, researchers of sacred texts, fine art experts, etc. A French philosopher, culture theorist, and historian Michel Foucault, in the first volume of his trilogy, Histoire de la sexualité, the history of sexuality, had literally created the historical narrative of the formation of contemporary homosexual identity. In the third volume of his trilogy, Foucault turned to the historical sources of the formation of the theoretically reasoned homosexual culture, while using corresponding passages from Plutarch and Pseudo-Lucian. What deserves a special attention of the researchers are homosexual and homoerotic relationships in the ancient world, in particular in Greece and Rome, and to a lesser extent in the East. In the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, there is a number of passages that can be interpreted as homoerotic ones. During the last decades, a dozen of scholars have disputed on the question whether any given passage is homosexual, or on the question what type or model of sexual behavior is relevant for each given passage. Some researchers, and we are referring not only to the apologists, insist on an exceptionally romantic and friendly nature of relationships in the fragments we will consider soon. Another group of scholars tends to find in these passages grounds reasonable enough to state homosexual relationships. Finally, a third group attempts to maneuver and argue about bisexuality and or homosexuality. I shall mention the researchers and their works later, but first let me make a review of the sources. My intention is not only to consider the question within the principal source, but also to appeal to a wide context of the ancient Near Eastern sources, and then come to some conclusions. Okay, well, David and Jonathan. In the first and second books of Samuel, we find probably the most known homoerotic narrative and poetical passages dedicated to the relationships of David and Jonathan, as well as of David and Saul. A young shepherd and psalmist David was brought to Saul when the Israeli king began to suffer on mental disorder. Citation, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 18, a servant of the king advises to call for David, son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, providing a particular profile of him and mentioning, among other things, his appearance, Ish Tor in Hebrew, comely person. A freestanding portrayal of David's appearance is given in the description of his meeting with Samuel the prophet. Vehu admoni im yefe einaim vetov roi. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to. In a certain moment, the relationship of David and Saul got sour when Saul began to be jealous of the military successes of David. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 7 to 9. But even before that, 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, David had established a special kind of friendship with King Saul's son, Jonathan. Several times, which is rather common for the Tanakh, David and Jonathan make an interpersonal and or interdynastical contract covenant among themselves. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 3 and 4, chapter 20, verses 11 to 16, chapter 23, verses 16 to 18. Jonathan's attitude towards David is described in the 18th and 20th chapters of the first book of Samuel. ויהי כחלתו לדבר אל שאול, ונפש יהונתן נקשרה בנפש דוד, ויהבו יהונתן כנפשו. And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And the next passage. ויוסף יהונתן להשביע את דוד באהבתו אותו כי אהבת נפשו אהבו. And Jonathan caused David to swear again because he loved him, for he loved him and he loved his own soul. Particularly indicative is the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 19, where for description of Jonathan's attitude towards David, not the word ahav, but a completely different verb is used, hafetz. The King James Version of the Bible suggests to translate this verb as delighted. Also, in fact, what this means is an ardent desire of a certain subject. וידבר שאול אל יונתן בנו ואל כל עבדיו להמית את דוד, ויונתן בן שאול חפץ בדוד מאוד. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 34, Jonathan grieved Ne'etzav in Hebrew for David, since Saul hated both David and him. The intimate attitude of David towards Jonathan is expressively and explicitly shown in the second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 26, where David bewails fallen Saul and Jonathan and uses, among others, the following words while weeping for Jonathan. צר לי עליך, אחי יהונתן, נעמת לי מאוד, נפלאת אהבתך לי מאהבת נשים. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been unto me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Yet through it all, in these biblical books, the wives of David are mentioned, at least 8 of them, as well as the wives and concubines taken by him in Jerusalem. See the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 13. Any wives and concubines of Jonathan are not mentioned. Still, it is emphasized that he had a son. 2 Samuel 4, chapter 4, verse 4. In fact, David takes this son under his protection. See the second book of Samuel, chapter 9, verse 11. Considering all this, one could rather presume bisexuality than homosexuality of the described characters, while acknowledging that their relationship was of homoerotic nature. Before analyzing the nature of this relationship in more detail, we shall turn our attention to similar topoi, topoi particular, plural. This for our translators. In the literary tradition of the ancient Near East, and this will give us grounds enough to state an influence of the ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt cultures on the Bible, as well as a succession of certain narratives, presumable taboos, even informal ones, and the practices reflected in the biblical corpus. So let's move to some other ancient Near Eastern sources, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The legendary Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh, or the poem He Who Saw the Deep, contains a narrative of a similar kind of relationships of the main characters, heroes Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The model of their personal interaction resembles the one of David and Jonathan. It represents the type of relationships which was common among warriors, and legendary warriors frequently became epic heroes, as we know, in the ancient Near East. Other types models included hierodulic servitude or sacred prostitution, male as well, intimate contacts with subordinates of various kinds, or rather those who did not share the same social status, such as slaves, prisoners, etc. Apparently, The editor of the books of Samuel was aware of the epic widespread in times of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 10th to 7th centuries before Common Era, when the material of the books was being assembled and edited. It should be pointed out that fragments of the epic have been found at Megiddo, where with great probability a settlement had existed in times of David's reign. In the last decade, 2 books dedicated to the mentioned topoi were published. These researches presented sorry, not in the last decade, but for 2 last decades. 2 books dedicated to the mentioned topoi were published. These researches presented a detailed analysis and comparison of biblical and Mesopotamian homoerotic passages. These are the books: When Heroes Love, the Ambiguity of Eros in the Stories of Gilgamesh and David, 2005, and by Professor Susan Ackerman from Dartmouth College, and Homosexuality and Liminality in the Gilgamesh and Samuel, 2007, by an Orientalist and ancient history researcher, Jean-Fabrice Nardelli. In the academic, I also need to add that in the academic literature, there was an attempt to compare the Mesopotamian topoi to the Greek ones. As for the Greek topoi, the fragments of Plato's Symposium and Homer's Odyssey were used regarding the relationships between Telemachus and Pisistratus, Achilles and Patroclus. It should be emphasized that in the Mesopotamian epic, the feelings of the heroes in the artistic devices used and the artistic tools used to describe them could almost match the ones from the Bible. Also, obviously, were their chronological predecessors. Both in the Tanakh and in the epic, one of the heroes from the couple is a king or a king-to-be. Gilgamesh is a ruler of a Sumerian city of Uruk. David is a future king of Judea. Similar to the biblical description of David's unique appearance, the epic lays a special emphasis on the outstanding physical bearing of Gilgamesh. Citation, his build was perfected, or graced with charm is his whole person, tablet 1. For according to the epic, the king of Uruk is 2/3 of him God and 1/3 human. However, in the epic, the beauty of both characters from the couple is described. Shamhat, the prostitute, speaks of Enkidu, Gilgamesh friend, created as his equal. You are, citation, you are handsome, Enkidu. You are just like a god. It was mentioned earlier in the epic that Enkidu bears long tresses like those of a woman. The hair of his head grows thickly as barley. The relationship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu had been predicted even before they met in a necromantic conversation of Gilgamesh with his mother. Like a wife you loved it, caressed and embraced it, a mighty comrade will come to you and be his friend's savior. And Gilgamesh answers, like a wife, I love it, caress and embrace it. In the Old Babylonian version, Pennsylvania tablet, Gilgamesh, or rather Gish, explains his dream thus. I saw him and I rejoiced. I loved him as a woman. I embraced him. I took him and regarded him as my brother. The epic depicts the love of Enkidu to Gilgamesh similarly to the feelings of Jonathan who loved David. as he loved his own soul. Shamhat predicts, so with love him like yourself. Tablet 2. Further, in the epic, there is a number of intimate scenes where the heroes embrace each other and hold hands at various times till the episode when Enkidu dies. Just as David, Gilgamesh bemoans his friend, Tablet 8. I shall weep for Enkidu, my friend. He covered like a bride the face of his friend. Like in the case of David and Jonathan, it is rather questionable whether Gilgamesh and Enkidu could be considered as obvious homosexuals. Firstly, because of the lack of explicit sexual acts and scenes. Secondly, because of heterosexual relationships of both heroes. To be more precise, because of their possible bisexuality. Gilgamesh possesses his own harem. Enkidu copulates with Shamhat. She spread her clothing and he lay upon her. She did for the man the work of a woman. His passion caressed and embraced her, Tablet 1. In a representative scene, Tablet 3, Enkidu blocks with his leg Gilgamesh's way to the harem and thereby tries to arrogate either the harem or Gilgamesh himself. What deserves a special mention is the intimate relationship of the king and his patron god. In the epic Tablet 1, it is shown the following way. Gilgamesh, it is whom divine Shamash loves. And in the Tanakh, please compare 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart. Bikesh Yud-Hei Vav-Hei Lo Ish Kilevav. Ancient Egyptian literature, epigraphy, and visual art have also maintained traces of presence of homoeroticism in the ancient Near East. We can find not fewer than 6 sources containing at least homoerotic allusions or even references to homosexual relationships depicted as well against the background of the imposed ban on them. So these sources are the Contendants of Horus and Set, the Book of the Dead, the Maxims of Ptahhotep, King Neferkar and General Senate, Akhenaten and Smechkar, Chnum Hotep and Nian Chnum, or another name of this source is the Tomb of Two Brothers. For instance, a novel from the times of the New Kingdom, The Contendants of Horus and Set, describes how these gods were once contended for power. Set said to Horus, "Come, let us spend a pleasant hour at my house." Horus answered, with pleasure, with pleasure." When it was evening, a bed was spread for them and they lay down. During the night, Set made his penis stiff and he placed it between the loins of Horus. Horus put his hands between his loins and caught the sperm of Set. Therefore, Set invited Horus to his house and raped him. On that ground, Set claimed in the court, "Let the office of a ruler be given to me, for as regards Horus who stands here, I have done a man's deed to him." However, through Isis's deception, Set was not able to establish the fact of rape and lost the court action. Certain researchers find in these storylines the narrators jest about the gods, and some interpret them as a caricature of justice. Homosexual relationships or same-sex relationships were also common in communities of the okay, we have 15 minutes Yeah, left. Ah, okay, because I'm just in the middle. Homosexual relationships, same-sex relationships were also common in communities of Minor Asia and in Persia. In the 5th century before Common Era, Herodotus wrote about the later ones. In the first book of his history, the history, paragraph 135, he claimed that the homosexual relationships were practiced by the Persians. According to Herodotus, this practice had been borrowed from the Greeks. The Persians, more than any other man, admit foreign usages. Moreover, they adopt all kinds of luxuries when they hear of them, and in particular, they have learned from the Greeks to have commerce with boys. They marry each one several lawful wives, and they get also a much larger number of concubines. Furthermore, there is a remain testimony of Athenaeus, a Greek rhetorician and grammarian, 2nd and 3rd centuries Common Era. In his Deipnosophist, he refers to an ancient Greek historiographer, Ctesias, 5th and 4th centuries before Common Era, while noting that the Persian king Artaxerxes used to have a favorite, a male dancer, Zeno of Crete. But let me also add that there is a discussion when we say about Greek Persian interferences and influence, because so there is another opinion. Russian philologist Alexei Losev and Azar Takhogodi in the 20th century assumed that also the same-sex love was remarkably common in Persia, yet particularly therefrom this tradition had come to Greece when strong relations were built between these countries. Finally, same-sex relations in the Judaic community had apparently existed in the 1st century Common Era as well, since the early Christianity tried to warn its adherents, in particular the neophytes against the temptation of same-sex love and its wrong understanding. In the New Testament, Paul the Apostle specified the categories of unjust men who cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Among them, 2 following categories are mentioned. Malakoi, who are traditionally understood to be passive homosexuals, and Sodomites, arsenokoitai, who in Greek, who in their turn were thought to be active homosexuals. In Romans chapter 1, verse 27, such kind of error is described when men have sexual intercourse with other men. And likewise, also the men living the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. In the Gospels, we can find at least homoerotic passages featuring the Master, Jesus of Nazareth. As it is known, in the Gospel of John, one of the Christ's disciples, John himself, several times was claimed to be the disciple whom Jesus loved. the same disciple was leaning on Jesus' bosom. According to the text, he possessed a special connection and reliance of Jesus, which is why Peter decided to find out who the traitor was only through the mediation of John. Then John, lying on Jesus' breast, asked him about it. Certain scholars as well perceive the relationship of a centurion and his servant cured by Jesus at the centurion's request, Gospels of Matthew and of Luke, as a homosexual one. Okay, well, for this final part of this presentation, let's please move to discussions, to the research and discussions. What did we discover about same-sex love, as it was mentioned in the title of this presentation? Having reviewed a number of topo and parallels to our topic in the literature of the ancient Near East, I shall come back to the narratives from the Tanakh and to the discussion they produce in the contemporary academic field. I have already mentioned three major groups the researchers engaged in the discussion on this topic could be divided into. However, a Norwegian Assyriology professor, Markus Zender, distinguishes four main views on the relationship of David and Jonathan. First, it was a homosexual, or at least a homoerotic relationship. Second, although the narrative doesn't describe an explicit homosexual encounter, the text does contain elements that allow such an interpretation. Third, this relationship was neither homosexual nor homoerotic, but only portrayed an extraordinary loyal friendship. And fourth, the relationship of David and Jonathan receives a homosexual connotation as a result of a queer reading, when the interpreters use the text to justify their own identity. After the publication of Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948, various authors attempt to go behind the traditional understanding of relationship of David and Jonathan. For example, a theologist, David R. Mays, called this relationship the comparatively harmless homosexual attachments of adolescents, which can sometimes occur. A psychiatrist, George Henry, wrote that David and Jonathan had definitely had sexual relationship where Jonathan was taking the lead and David was the tempting object of desire, shrinking Jonathan's aspirations away by himself. George Henry considered that if nothing had been said about any further homosexual relationships of David, moreover, if there was a rather detailed narration about his many wives, therefore, for David, homosexuality was just a transitional period. An Orientalist and anthropologist, Raphael Patai, argues that the love story between Jonathan, the son of King Saul, and David, the beautiful young hero, must have been occurred many times in royal courts in all parts of the Near East and in all epochs. The first researcher who in 1978 had published a full monograph dedicated to the relationship of David and Jonathan was Tom Horner, who obtained his PhD degree at Columbia University. The author reminds us that the first greatest love story in the world, one of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, originated from an epic which was widespread in the ancient Near East. No mourner in the history of the world, except perhaps Alexander at the passing of his friend Hephaestion, has ever been more broken up over the loss of his or her beloved friend as Gilgamesh was after Enkidu had untimely passed away. While expressing his love and loss after Jonathan's death, David was only following this tradition. John Boswell, a history professor from the Yale University, pointed out that the term brother applied by David towards Jonathan, 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26, was historically used to signify same-sex relationships. One should mention that this was the same way Gilgamesh and Enkidu called each other. Nianchunum and Chnumhotep in Egypt were brothers too. David Halperin, a literature professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, notes that both in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the books of Samuel, the relationships between friends are built as both brotherly and matrimonial ones. However, not all researchers intend to at least suggest homosexuality or homoeroticism in the relationships of David and Jonathan. They tend to read corresponding markers from the text in a fully different traditional way. For instance, Professor Stan Rummel, Texas Wesleyan University, considers that Jonathan's giving off his robe and weapons to David during the covenant was simply a political symbol for handing the throne over to him. Professor Jerry Landay, University of Illinois, suggests that the friendship of Jonathan and David was the embodiment of the sheer love of man for man and intimacy based on shared experiences and dangers, a kind of intuitive trust that transcends the taint of ambition, jealousy, or the claim of sex. Academic discussion on the David's and Jonathan's relationship emerged with a new vigor in the late 1990s and were producing lively exchange, especially in the first decade of the 21st century. Among the main disputants, one must name the already mentioned Susan Ackerman, Marcus Zander, Jean-Fabrice Nardelli, but also Martin Nisinen, Saul Oljan, Robert Gagnon, Sylvia Schroer, and Thomas Staubli, Thomas Romer, and Louis Bonjour. Marcus Zander and Robert Gagnon, professor at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, as conservative theologists, claimed that love between David and Jonathan was of merely emotional and spiritual nature and fully deprived of sexuality. In other words, assuming the point of view of the mentioned scholars, the narrative concerns only homosociality or exceptionally social same-sex interaction. Unfortunately, the works of these researchers may contain critical gaps. Marcus Zander, for example, fully ignores the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is undoubtedly a key source for the comparison. Susan Ackerman, Jean-Fabrice Nardelli, Louis Bonjour, and Thomas Romer note that the fact that the epic was rather widespread can testify to the high level of recognition and acceptance of same-sex male love in the ancient Near East. Similar to the epic, the books of Samuel contain multiple markers of sexual activity, subtle clues, which gives us defined reasons to consider the relationship of the heroes to be intimately sexual, similar to matrimonial ones. The most striking examples of such markers can be found in the scene of Saul's outburst of anger and jealousy, as well as in the eulogy of David to Jonathan. The following lexical items could be interpreted as such markers: Ahava, Chafetz, Naim, Ach, Bachar, Brit, Neshek. A professor of the University of Lausanne, Thomas Romer, and a zoologist, Louis Bonjour, discovered in both cases of the Epic of Gilgamesh as well of the books of Samuel, a significant number of passages where matrimonial metaphors and erotic images are used. They serve to represent a complete characteristic portrayal of each partner in every particular case. Susan Ackerman and Jean-Fabrice Nardelli consider that there is something more than homosexuality behind the relationship of David and Jonathan. They presume that the editors of the books of Samuel concealed the references on the same-sex relationship, which alluded to the fact that David and Jonathan were lovers indeed. Susan Ackerman believes that the editors were using particular literary devices, literary tools to express the idea of ousting Jonathan from power in favor of David, and therefore to secure David's right to mount the throne. Jean-Fabrice Nardelli disagrees with Susan Ackerman, claiming that multiple covenants initiated by Jonathan could be reasonably perceived as the matrimonial ones. Susan Ackerman adopts for her research the methods of symbolical anthropology. The researcher presumes that in the first and the second books of Samuel, the language of sophisticated eroticism is used and highlights 6 separate fragments focused on the relationship of David and Jonathan. First, the first ever meeting of David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Second, the most significant description of the first meetings of David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 19. Third, the episode of Saul reproaching Jonathan for his friendship with David in 1 Samuel chapter 20. Fourth, David's escape from the King Saul's court in 1 Samuel chapter 20. Fifth, the description of the final meeting of David with Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 23. And sixth, the eulogy lament of David over Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel chapter 1, known as the Song of the Bow. From these 6 fragments, Ackerman highlights the lament of David as the most important, considering that the passage contains the statement of David that the love of Jonathan to him was passing the love of women. While David was a married man, nevertheless, he distinguishes between his relationship with Jonathan and his bonds to women. David, as mentioned above, was married to many women. One of them was Melchola or Michal, the sister of Jonathan. However, the biblical texts tell nothing about the love of David to Melchola. Also, the fact of Melchola's love to David is mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 18. I'm finishing in a few minutes. Still, as pointed out by Saul...
Пане Віталію, даруйте, я не хотілося б переривати вашу доповідь, але у нас залишається, будь ласка, буквально 7 хвилин до наступної доповіді. Чи не могли б ви закінчувати, тому що я би ще кілька хвилин...
Пані Світлана, коли я сказав закінчувати, я мав на увазі реально хвилину-дві. Я закінчую.
Дуже дякую.
Так. Я потім розповім анекдот вам з цього приводу. Still, as pointed out by Saul Olyan, a professor of theology at Brown University, when we reflect on David's eulogy to Jonathan, it is not at all clear whether the author or editor of the books of Saul attributed any homoerotic meaning to the comparison of Jonathan to women in 2 Samuel chapter 1, since what was crucially important for the author was to show that David was not responsible for the death of Saul and his family in his attempt to unite the nation. Presumably, the comparison of Jonathan to women or certain feminization of him in the eulogy lament of David was instrumental for strengthening David's masculine image. In this respect, Romer and Bonjour mentioned that in the ancient Near East, the sexual relationships were always interpreted through the notions of active and passive sexual roles. Furthermore, the passive one was later prescribed only to women, eunuchs, male prostitutes, etc. Sylvia Schroer and Thomas Staubli suppose that it is the text itself that suggests us the idea of homosexuality in the books of Samuel. Furthermore, these scholars offer two important opinions. First, the existence of the ban on homosexual relationship doesn't mean that the law was de facto always respected and that in the society there was no place left for homosexual practices. And second, it would be we cannot exclude any possibility a priori of homosexual desire only because a person has a heterosexual relationship. The researchers also draw a parallel between the passage where Jonathan invites David to go out into the field, Lecha v'nitza hasadeh, in 1 Samuel chapter 20, a place where into the lovers were perhaps occasionally going to meet in private, and the fragment from the Song of Solomon where the maid whispers to her beloved, "Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field." In Song of Solomon, the maid wishes that her lover would be her brother, so she could kiss him in public without being despised. Presumably, the protagonists of the books of Samuel attempted to legitimize their relationship in a similar manner, whereas making it more public. So, some conclusions. First, as it follows from the analysis and comparative studies of the relevant texts and topoi, we can definitely assert neither that the homosexual relationship were described in the books of Samuel, nor the contrary. Nevertheless, a wide range of markers undoubtedly presented in the text permits us to characterize this relationship as homoerotic as well as homosocial one. Another reason that counts in favor of the relative nature of these hypothetically homosexual relationships is the fact that the characters had also had heterosexual ones. In other words, here it is more correct to speak of bisexuality rather than of homosexuality. Second, the homoerotic ancient Hebraic tradition was definitely influenced by the similar traditions of Mesopotamia and Egypt, par excellence by the first of them being widespread in the ancient Near East. Third, the homoeroticism remained in the ancient Jewish texts up until the 1st century, at least until the 1st century Common Era. Specifically, it is represented even in the New Testament tradition Gospels. Okay, the Talmud is another story, maybe for the next time. The existence of the taboo, the existence of the taboo, rather informal one, could be the main reason of absence of explicit references to homosexual relationships in the text. Despite this taboo, it is theoretically possible that homosexual relationships still existed. Homosexual practices could be represented both as a part of sacred or temple prostitution, blamed and prosecuted by religious law, and as interpersonal relationships. And fifth, contemporary scholars adopt essentially different attitudes towards the interpretation of the relationship of David and Jonathan, from considering this relationship as entirely homosocial one to the assumption that it had an obviously homosexual nature. There is still a third research notion that is also held by me. According to this point of view, there are no sufficient reasons to consider the before mentioned biblical characters as to homosexual men. However, as noted above, their interaction often was of explicitly homoerotic nature. Therefore, a researcher doesn't have any reasonable cause to ignore or conceal this suggestion. Thank you so much for your attention. знаєте, я колись був на одній конференції, там, де один пан читав свою доповідь. І він читає, і вже там 15-20 хвилин весь час уже забрано давно. І вже півгодини. І модератор тоді каже, оце, знаєте, 3-4 вже попереджені. І в якийсь момент доповідач не витримує і каже, "Why are you interrupting me? I didn't finish with my introduction."
Так, дуже дякую за жарт. Дякую, пане Віталію, за таке цікаве і сумлінне дослідження. І насправді квір-культура – це нова тема, яка викликає і різне потрактування, і нові дослідження викликають велике зацікавлення. Я думаю, що у нас є час, дозволю собі виділити час на хоча б одне запитання до вас. Шановні колеги, якщо є питання до пана Віталія, прошу. Пане Віталію, ви можете закрити. Так, є питання?
Yes, I have a question here.
Так,
Should
прошу.
I speak in English? Sorry, I will switch on my camera. Okay. Okay. Should I ask the question in English or in Ukrainian?
Anyone.
Як хочете, пане Петре.
Добре, я тоді українською. Пане Віталій, моя, значить, що називається research interest, досить далеко від того, над чим ви працюєте. Ну, по-перше, дякую за доповідь. В мене таке більше базове питання. Як можна щось знайти? Бо титул, назва доповіді була Discovering Something, там і далі по тексту. Тобто це йдеться про, може я щось пропустив там у вашій доповіді, йдеться про нову інтерпретацію чогось, чи там, власне, якісь нові тексти, чи і те, і інше? Дякую.
Дякую, пане Петре. Це дуже слушне запитання. Тобто мета цього дослідження полягала в тому, щоб на певному етапі підбити підсумок, умовний підсумок досліджень, які були станом. Це дослідження, яке не робилося останніми місяцями, так, воно було зроблено ще в попередні роки. І перша версія була вже опублікована. Я сподіваюся, що я зроблю апдейт ще цієї своєї статті. Завдання було розглянути, зібрати максимально всі дослідницькі думки, по-перше, з цього питання, так, але, звичайно, що розглянути їх в контексті джерел, оскільки я сам працюю з джерелами, є джерелознавцем, гебреїстом, так, то моє завдання полягало, щоб розглядати джерела, і які були розглянуті, але, що називається, щоб енгл був, тобто, не завжди той, що раніше лунав, і я розглядав максимально також і широко і джерела, тобто ті джерела, які дослідники, коли ви слухали цю доповідь, то ви, очевидно, почули про епос про Гільгамеша, і про єгипетські джерела, і грецькі джерела, і те, що я сказав, що деяким дослідникам бракувало розгляду певних джерел, тобто вони зосереджувалися на одному джерелі, чи на двох джерелах, чи на трьох джерелах. Тобто максимальна широта розгляду різноманітних джерел із моїм джерелознавчим поглядом і розгляд всіх досліджень, бо, інакше кажучи, як ми розуміємо, дослідження, яке не враховує всіх попередніх думок, воно теж є неповноцінне. І тому це все робилося в комплексі джерелознавчому і, так би мовити, як у нас скажуть, історіографічному, так, в країні.
Так, дуже дякую, пане Віталію. На жаль, ми вже не маємо часу і доведеться переходити до іншої доповіді. Але